Hello and welcome to my channel, I Win to Lose Gaming. If you're here to learn how to get the thickest damage numbers with the newest featured 5-star character, Yanagi, well that's probably why you clicked on this video, which will hopefully teach you everything you need to know about Yanagi. There's no other way to put it. Yanagi has some massive disorder nukes. She's all about outputting a constant flow of disorders as the newest premium S-rank agent in Zenless Zone 0. This video was filmed on the early access server and is not indicative of the final product. There may be some changes on release, so be sure to check the comments down below to see if there are any. In this video, we'll go over her kit, her drives and stats, Wenjins, Mindscapes, teams, which will include some bangbus as well, a showcase, and of course my opinion at the end. So in order to understand Yanagi, we need a crash course on Anomaly. Basically, Yanagi will apply Anomaly onto the enemy, where once the circle is full, you're able to trigger Shock, which deals damage up to once every second when you hit the enemy. Shock deals damage based on the Anomaly proficiency stat instead of crit. Also, normal disorders occur when you apply a second Anomaly onto the enemy, which removes the previous Anomaly and deals damage scaling off the remaining duration of the previous Anomaly plus some bonus disorder damage. Now, Yanagi, being the special character that she is, actually has her own special disorder, which we'll go into more detail about soon enough. Starting off with Yanagi's basic attack, Tsukuyomi Kagura, Yanagi has two stances. Jogen's stance is the blue stance, and Kagen's stance is the yellow stance. In all honesty, it's pretty hard to tell which stance she's in. And there's another visual indicator, which is the color of her hair ring changes color as well, but this is really hard to see in actual combat. Either way, it's actually not too important, which we'll get into later. For both stances, starting from B3 and beyond, Yanagi's basic attacks will deal lightning damage instead of physical damage, and you can swap stances by simply tapping her skill button, which performs a regular skill regardless of how much energy you have, and this switches her stance. Notably, if you use her regular skill after B3, B4, or B5, you immediately start from B3 with the next stance instead of going back to B1, thus improving her performance and electric anomaly application drastically, as you definitely want to skip her essentially useless physical B1 and B2 attacks. Honestly though, after some further testing, which stance you're in doesn't actually matter much. And instead, what's important is to actively switch stances. Each stance provides a buff, with Jogen increasing her electric damage by 10% and Kagen increasing her pen ratio by 10%. And when you switch a stance, the previous stance's buff will linger for 8 seconds. This encourages you to switch your stance at least once every 8 seconds in order to maintain 100% uptime on these buffs. Now, I wanted to talk about perhaps the most important takeaway when it comes to these stances. As we can see in this chart, the anomaly applied per second, damage, and days for both stances B3 through B5 is nearly identical. So again, I wouldn't worry too much about which stance you're in per se, and mainly just focus on switching regularly at least once every 8 seconds to maintain her 8-second stance buffs as well as to avoid her useless B1 and B2. Now the next most important part of her kit is her EX special. Unlike most other characters, her EX special is performed by holding the special attack button and costs 40 energy. If there's an anomaly on the enemy like Shock, Yanagi will trigger a special polarity disorder, which deals 15% of whatever disorders on the enemy, if that anomaly were to be disordered, plus 3200% of Yanagi's anomaly proficiency stat multiplied by all the damage bonuses that you would come to expect from a disorder. An added bonus is that unlike traditional disorders, this polarity disorder does not remove the original anomaly. Another important property about her EX special is that she enters Shinran Bancho state, which lasts for 15 seconds and is indicated by this buff icon under Yanagi's health bar. Shinran Bancho state is important because it allows you to essentially always skip her physical B1 and B2, thus improving her combo game. Interestingly, the only way for her to still do physical damage while in Shinran Bancho state is to do her dash attack, so try to avoid her dash attack during Shinran Bancho. Another great perk about Shinran Bancho is that you can now swap cancel her long B5s more freely. Without Shinran Bancho, if you just bring her back onto the field after a swap cancel after a B5, she'll be back to doing her terrible B1 and B2 when you swap her back on. However, with Shinran Bancho active, now you can swap cancel her B5 and come back onto the field to immediately go into B3 to avoid her useless B1 and B2. There are a few more ways for her to skip her useless B1 and B2, and these are as follows: her dodge counter, assist follow-up, defensive assist follow-up, chain attack, and ultimate all allow her to skip B1 and B2 to go straight into B3. Basically, as long as you do literally anything besides raw dog that basic attack button outside of Shinran Bancho state and her dash attack, she'll skip her useless physical damage attacks. The last important part of her kit is her ultimate. Her ultimate not only applies a ton of anomaly as expected, it also provides an additional polarity disorder for free. As such, Yanagi's ultimate becomes a very high priority on her team. Finally, let's talk about her core skill. Her core skill adds 250% additional damage multiplier to disorders triggered by the team for 15 seconds after Yanagi activates her EX special. This is a modest but always, of course, welcomed increase to disorder damage. For example, Bernice's disorders typically have around a 1450% damage multiplier, so this will increase Bernice's burn disorder damage number multiplier up to 1700%, which is a modest but obviously welcomed increase to Bernice's disorder damage. Her core also increases Yanagi's electric damage by 20% at level F for 15 seconds against an enemy hit by her EX special. So as you can see, a huge part of her kit revolves around her EX special. Next, her faction bonus or additional ability is activated when there is another electric or anomaly character on her team. She is, I believe, the first character's additional ability / faction bonus to not actually include having someone from her faction to activate. When her faction bonus is active, her basic attack's electric anomaly buildup increases by 45% when she switches stances for 8 seconds, making this a great additional ability that should be prioritized to fulfill for her teams. So all this is honestly a bit confusing at first, so we can take a quick look at a sample rotation. We start off the engagement with her EX special to skip B1 and B2, and this allows us to follow up with Kagen B3 to B5. In fact, you can do 2 Kagen B3 to B5s in that 8-second buff duration. After 2 Kagen B3 to B5s, you can now use her skill to swap stances in order to refresh the 8-second stance buff. Now we can just literally rinse and repeat this using EX specials or regular specials to continue this combo string for literally as long as we like. Now, as with other anomaly characters, the amount of anomaly Yanagi applies is the same regardless of talent levels, and since only roughly 19.1% of her damage on a shock team comes from her raw damage output, we don't really care about her talent levels for the multiplier increase. However, leveling her EX special and chain increases the anomaly proficiency scaling of her polarity disorder. As such, I personally will prioritize her core and skill, and then her chain and ultimate. And I actually disagree with the game's suggestion of leveling her basics as a top priority, and I personally instead put her basics after her chain and ultimate, with her assist and then her dash attack being the last things to level. Let's drive on over to the drives and stats. Yanagi is yet another character who suffers severely from the "it depends" ascites syndrome. When calculating for disorders and, well, anomaly in general, everything is super situational and different situations will have different optimal builds. So please take the following calcs and advice as just that, advice. But hopefully it'll provide you the knowledge you need to make your own decisions in the end. Yanagi has 2 main playstyles, shock and disorder, and unfortunately for me, that means doing a lot more math. The shock playstyle relies almost entirely on Yanagi's damage and typically has a team focused on buffing her damage as much as possible. Meanwhile, a disorder team pairs her with another non-electric anomaly character like Bernice to, well, output disorders. These playstyles have different recommended builds. Looking at her drive sets, we can see that the 4-piece Chaos Jazz with the 2-piece Freedom Blues is great on both builds. Now when it comes to the other 2-piece set bonuses, the 2-piece Thunder Metal is the next best option, with the usual suspects of the 2-piece Hormone Punk and 2-piece Puffer Electro as always being usable but not the best options. The 4-piece Hormone Punk and 4-piece Freedom Blues are options that exist and I felt like I had to say something about them, but unfortunately I can't recommend them for the 4-piece set due to them doing notably less damage for very little gain. Now as for the main stats, let's start with the Shock build. We can see in this chart both the DPS and the total anomaly applied. Fortunately, the shock build is much more straightforward, with anomaly proficiency in slot 4, electric damage in slot 5, and attack percent in slot 6 being my recommendation. because you can generally maintain shock on the enemy and you'll have much longer field time with Yanagi. As such, you don't really need an Anomaly Mastery main stat in slot 6 in pretty much most situations. For the shock build, the 4-piece Thunder Metal is actually better / competitive to the 4-piece Chaos Jazz, so there's also that to consider. Now moving on to the Burn plus Shock Disorder build, things start to get really messy here, especially for slot 6, which is where she suffers from a terminal case of it depends ascites. In my opinion, both attack percent and Anomaly Mastery are viable options for slot 6. While you do around 10% less damage assuming the same overall number of anomalies applied in a Burn plus Shock Disorder team, the anomaly applied is 30% higher with Anomaly Mastery as the main stat, potentially allowing you to activate an additional disorder which isn't factored into these calculations. This is why I left the Anomaly applied column in the chart, so you can make your own decision based on the information presented here. Now with all that being said, overall I'd say both attack percent or Anomaly Mastery are good options for slot 6 for a disorder focused team, so take your pick depending on your preference and perhaps the situation or perhaps even the substats on them. When I tried both, they both felt fine to me and frankly hard to notice in the heat of battle. As for substats, fortunately it's quite straightforward with Anomaly Proficiency being the best substat by far, then attack percent, and then after that flat pen, and finally flat attack and crit don't really provide much and are generally not really recommended to focus on, but you know, they still increase your damage. Basically, try to get as much Anomaly Proficiency as possible. Up next, we have Yanagi's Wenjins. Yanagi's signature Wenjin is by far her best option. It's one of the only Wenjins that actually significantly increases the amount of anomaly that she applies, and the bonus disorder damage goes hard with her kit for obvious reasons. For my initial testing, this disorder damage 25% bonus or whatever it's called is basically its own unique multiplier and multiplies the final disorder damage as long as she triggers the disorder. As such, for the Burn plus Shock Disorder team, I've also included the additional damage Bernice's disorder does thanks to her signature Wenjin as part of Yanagi's damage, which actually makes up around 6.5% of her total damage output with her signature Wenjin. This makes the Time Weaver way better on disorder teams thanks to both the increased anomaly application as well as the increased disorder damage. And keep in mind, as I mentioned from earlier, the Shock plus Disorder DPS doesn't even include any potential additional disorders, which is a bit messy to just kind of assume that you're going to get, so that's why I didn't include an additional entire disorder. Anyway, with all that yapping about it depends ascites, comparing her signature Wenjin to her overall best free-to-play option of the U5 Weeping Gemini, we can see that with attack percent in slot 6, with the Weeping Gemini, she's doing just 83% of the damage of her signature Wenjin, along with applying 30% less anomaly. Alternatively, if we use an Anomaly Mastery main stat in slot 6 with the Weeping Gemini, now she's doing just 76% of the damage of her signature Wenjin. So yeah, her signature Wenjin is a massive gain for Shock plus Burn Disorder teams, beating out all the other Wenjins by far for both damage and anomaly application. Now there are a few caveats with her signature Wenjin. One, I highly recommend having at least 300 anomaly proficiency on her stat page to actually trigger this weapon's disorder damage buff. This way you'll reach 375 anomaly proficiency to gain the disorder damage multiplier. This means that if you equip the 4-piece Chaos Jazz plus 2-piece Freedom Blues with Anomaly Proficiency main stat in slot 4, you'll need at least 4 Anomaly Proficiency substat rolls, which is pretty easy to achieve to reach 300 and thus 375. The second caveat is that the Time Weaver has a pretty significant ramp up time. Because her signature needs to hit an enemy with an anomaly on them in order to gain 75 anomaly proficiency, your first anomaly often is going to do fiddlesticks in damage in comparison. So yeah, I've included a buff down calculation where we can see it doing around 85% of when the buff is up. This mainly just applies for the first anomaly, so do keep that in mind. And finally, while the damage here looks a bit bleak for her other weapon options, in the Burn plus Shock Disorder team with Bernice, keep in mind that in a full team scenario, the other disorder character, Bernice, will do around half of the team's damage output, which makes this gap significantly smaller. Anyway, to continue yapping about her Shock plus Burn Disorder Wenjins, my recommendations are as follows. Her signature is better than the Fusion Compiler, which is greater than the Electra Lip Gloss, followed by the Weeping Gemini, and then the Rainforest Gourmet, and finally the other random options, with again her signature being significantly better than the other options. So in other words, for free-to-plays, I recommend the Weeping Gemini for a shock plus burn disorder team. However, for a pure shock focused team, the other Wenjins have smaller damage differences due to the additional damage from Bernice's disorder not being included in Yanagi's damage profile. And since the amount of anomaly applied by a pure shock build is now not as important, the gap in performance is even smaller. We can see that the Weeping Gemini with 2 stacks average is doing around 88.3% of the damage of her signature. Now the order of Wenjins is basically the same, but with her signature greater than Fusion Compiler, greater than the Battle Pass Electro Lip Gloss, greater than the Weeping Gemini, which now in my opinion equals the Rainforest Gourmet, greater than the others. Alright, moving on to her Mindscapes.
Mindscapes.
Here's a gif of what happens when you bug Yanagi at work, to keep your attention for the worst retention part of this video. So when it comes to her Mindscapes as well as her signature Wenjin, definitely in my opinion, I would go for her signature Wenjin first, because this thing not only increases damage by a very substantial amount, it also increases the anomaly application by a tremendous amount, which is where, you know, the value of it really comes from. It's not just the damage, it's also the anomaly application. Now, our Mindscape 1 basically just adds 80 anomaly proficiency and some invincibility. This does give her a lot more damage. However, this is assuming 100% uptime, which, you know, you're not going to have because you're going to get hit on occasion, but still it should be a pretty solid offensive and defensive option. Mindscape 2 is really weird and interesting, and honestly it can be considered kind of a side grade because you're spending more energy to deal more damage. In the end, you don't actually deal a whole lot more damage overall, as well as you have a bit more stricter time windows when it comes to the Shinran Bancho buffing duration, since you'll be spending more energy per EX because each additional thrust costs 10 energy, therefore you spend 60 instead of 40 energy. That means that you're going to have lower uptime on Shinran Bancho state. However, assuming you keep her on field a lot, you should still be able to maintain pretty much 100% Shinran Bancho state. And in some situations, it can do more damage. And more importantly, you can make it do more damage when it counts. And it's always great to see bigger numbers regardless, just kind of for the dopamine hit. M3 is expensive, adds 2 levels, doesn't really add much to it, but it does add a small bit more anomaly proficiency scaling to her EX special, as well as her chain and liberation. M4 adds 16% pen ratio versus anomaly enemies, which is fine. M5 is another expensive joke, adding 2 more talent levels. And finally, M6 basically builds on M2, allowing her to do 2 additional thrusts, but also for half the energy per thrust, therefore still making it cost 60 energy. So you are basically just doing more damage with a tiny bit more field time, and this one is, you know, a bit more notable of an increase, around 11.4%. Now these Mindscapes 2 and 6 in particular need a bit more testing, so do keep that in mind. And finally, you can go up to M6U5 Time Weaver. Very expensive, but she'll probably be doing roughly twice the amount of damage on a shock team and roughly 1.72 times the damage on a burn plus shock disorder team. Alright, let's go through some teams for Yanagi, starting with this first one, which is a very free-to-play friendly team for Yanagi consisting of Ambi as well as Lucy. You can of course substitute any of these characters for other various free-to-play friendly options, like for example substituting Ambi with Piper in order to make a more disorder focused team. This was my personal favorite. I guess I'm going to call it Hyper Shock Team, which really just puts the shock value in Yanagi's damage for her to maximize her shock damage, with Rina absolutely catapulting the potential damage ceiling of Yanagi, as well as Caesar providing, you know, obviously the defensive utility, but also stunning on top of massive damage buffs. Now, this is the Premium Disorder team, which focuses on disordering with Bernice as well as Yanagi. You can alternate between burn as well as shock in order to provide a ton of disorder damage. Of course, Caesar is able to buff a significant portion of both of these characters' damage. And yeah, in terms of the Bang Boo though, this gets a little bit tricky. Even though Rocket Boo doesn't get its passive, I actually think I liked using Rocket Boo to help Bernice apply more burn anomalies, Since Yanagi spends a bit more time on field thus applying, overall I'd say more electric anomaly than Bernice applies, although I'm actually not 100% sure about that. But either way, I found that having one of these bang boosts help apply either lightning or fire anomaly was helpful, even if they don't get their passive. And finally, there's absolutely no reason why you can't use her with Jane Doe either. When it comes to physical assault related disorders, they do much less damage than, for example, burn or lightning disorders, but obviously that's made up by Jane doing a ton of damage herself. And you can always use Seth or literally, pretty much any character like Caesar or a support character like Lucy to buff both their damage. Whatever really floats your boat. It's pretty hard to go wrong when it comes to building a team involving Yanagi as well as Jane. We've made it to the showcase section of the video, and we're going to start this off with the premium shock team. You can see here that I actually forcibly grouped those, whatever those things are, together with a few of Yanagi's basic attacks. I was able to immediately apply shock with a single EX special in order to polarity disorder them on the shock application, which makes her actually better than I expected for taking out random waves of stuff. Something that, some other Anomaly characters struggle a little bit with. But in this case, obviously you can see that she did incredibly well there. Now, some interesting qualities about using Rina along with Yanagi is that you actually have to pay attention to kind of which shock you are currently dealing with. Because ideally you actually, while you want Rina's buffs up, you don't want to dump all your, damage during a low damaging shock, which, if Rina applies a lot of the electric anomaly, that means that a lot of the electric anomaly damage that you'll be doing is going to be from Rina's shock. So we can see here 700k disorders, and bam, once Yanagi fully applied the disorder, you can see that she did over 900k. So in this run, I didn't really consider that while I was doing it, but after watching this run, I realized, hey, I should be utilizing a full shock from Yanagi instead of kind of a distributed shock between Rina as well as Yanagi. So anyway, we're going to do pretty much the same opener here, but this time we are doing the nitro fuel at the office. This is what happens when you have Bernice cater at your office. You are now all drinking nitro fuel, and it is a very questionable substance. We can see here that I'm playing very poorly, but hey, this is, just a rough showcase of what these characters can do. Just the usual stuff. You want to try to apply, as much fire and whatever anomaly and electric anomaly in order to prepare for a big disorder. And I believe there I just kind of went a little gung-ho and just went for the first disorder regardless. And I guess it ended up working out just fine. Clear times are pretty similar. And because shock there was almost over, you can see that the shock disorder didn't do as much damage. And at this point now, the fire disorder is also, pretty much cooked. So we can see that the timings here are quite poor. But regardless, the team is still going to perform just fine. I think that was a pretty big double disorder. Well, the polarity disorder plus the shock disorder. And now they're just going crazy all over the place on this robot. Even though this robot doesn't resist fire, even though this robot is not weak to fire, but it is weak to electric, we can see that Bernice is clearly contributing a ton to this team. Now, what happens when there are pay cuts and layoffs? Well, you get this team. It's a bit copium, and personally, I think Piper would probably be a little bit better for this team. But, it's fine. It ends up working out, but now all the characters are using very free-to-play friendly Wenjins, although I believe Ambi and Lucy are using their signatures at upgrade 5, so they are, slightly a bit better. However, when it comes to Yanagi, she is using, is it the Weeping Gemini or the other one, the one that looks like a little monster that's about to chomp you? That one's pretty cute, but either way, she's using a free-to-play friendly Wenjin, and you will see a big difference in damage, especially with these teammates who, we don't have two buffers in the shock team, and we also don't have Bernice doing massive disorders herself. So we're going to see much smaller disorders in comparison to, what we experienced in the previous runs. We can see here just 300 something 50k polarity disorders. Of course, having, better teams or, Caesar or Rina as well will drastically improve the damage. But we are still able to perfectly reasonably clear this in a very reasonable amount of time still. In roughly, I believe, 108 seconds for the free-to-play Yanagi, and you can see this chart on the screen. And for the premium shock team, it took 64 seconds. Nitro fuel at the office was 61 seconds. So we can see here that pretty much the more money you spend, the faster you will be able to clear, which makes perfect sense when it comes to a gacha game like this. But yeah, I mean, obviously Yanagi's definitely going to be the premium electric DPS character, capable of being run in just more of a pure shock team as well as a disorder team. Really, you can mix and match when it comes to your preferences, playstyle, character availability, and if the enemy is weak to lightning or frankly, weak to one of the other elements that you might have an anomaly character to do damage with, you're going to do just fine. As always, I appreciate every single one of you. This is I Want to Lose, signing out.